Hi, my name is Bianca, and I will be explaining what we have learned in the first lesson of the course, which is the definition of developmental systems approach. So the developmental systems approach argues that nature and nurture are inherently fused, and they both contribute together to the development of a person. It argues that we as humans depend, or our development depends on the interactions we have with the environment, and that we are influenced by multiple factors at different levels of organization. In this lesson, we also learned about two different theories. The first one being the theory of Bronfenbrenner, who was a Russian-American psychologist. He believes in what he calls the bioecological model. Now, this bioecological model basically just means that we're not only influenced as people by our genes. Like, that is not everything that defines us or everything that shapes us, but also we are shaped by the ecology or our surroundings, our environment. And to make this even more specific, Bronfenbrenner describes 5 different subsystems that we live in and that affect us either directly or indirectly in our development. So the first one is called the microsystem, and this is basically the environments or the people that a child is directly relating to. So usually that's the parents or the teachers at school, or even like the neighbors in his neighborhood. But it is specifically like child and that person, so it's a very direct and very close relationship that obviously affects the child. So next up we have the mesosystem, which is all those different things that I mentioned: the parents, the neighborhood, or the school, relating with each other. So it's no longer about the child and them, but themselves. So like the relationship between the parents and the teachers at school, or the relationship between parents and the people in the neighborhood. So basically the relationship that the parents in the school have, or the school with his home, can affect the child as well, because if things aren't going as well at home and then the teachers find out, they can work together to accommodate the child, for example. So this mesosystem is also referred to as just the social class. Usually like the social class that you're in defines the types of people that are in your school, the types of people that are in your neighborhood, and the types of people that your parents are, and how they all relate to each other in order for your life to be a certain way. Okay, so the next system is the exosystem, and this one is not super directly relating to the child, but it definitely affects the child as well. It doesn't depend on the child at all. It depends more of just the circumstances. So for example, the parents' jobs, the health system, welfare. So these are like bigger factors that can affect the kid indirectly, but obviously it does impact at least the quality of life that the child would have. Next up, we have macrosystems, which is even more indirectly and like broader and less in control of the child. I would call or refer to microsystem as simply like the culture or the country that the child lives in. The specific factors mentioned are culture, laws, and resources. So it's more about like, I guess, it's a more global impact. And lastly, we have the Chrono System, which is the influence of time and history. So all of these subsystems do affect the development of a child, as argued by Bronfenbrenner. And that's just a way for us to see how so many different things can affect someone, and it's not only about like their genetic buildup. Yeah, it is discussed that this theory also helps us organize the myriad of factors that can influence development, as I said. And yeah, it just helps us kind of put things into categories and levels so we know how much different things in our surroundings can shape us as we grow. And then next up we have another theory by Gilbert Gottlieb, which he calls the Probabilistic Epigenesis. Basically, this is the way in which our genes are affected by other levels. Those other levels that he refers to are neurons, behavior, and environment. This theory, what it does is it explains more how everything affects everything, basically. Our genes, for example, can affect our neurons, and our neurons can affect our behavior, and our behavior can affect our environment, and then our environment can affect our genes. So he's kind of arguing that our genes can change with time as we interact with our environment. And that makes sense because even just in like evolution history, we can see it as humans as we adapt to new things and new technologies and a more modern world. Other generations comes in with certain qualities that previous generations didn't have before. So that's like how one thing affects a bigger influence with time, and how ultimately our environment goes back to our genes and like kind of modifies them. Let's see. So the word epigenesis means a change in genetic expression as a result of environmental influences. That's his specific definition. And yeah, it's just the relationship between all these different levels: genes, neurons, behavior, and environment, and how they can be dynamic amongst themselves and like shape each other to successfully link genes and nervous systems to behavioral outcomes. So that's the second theory we learned. By the developmental system approach, we learned that there are so many different levels to someone's development that it can actually become very complex, like a very complex phenomenon to understand in the first place. So that's why it requires an interdisciplinary approach, because we can learn from like different theories and just organize how all these different levels of description can affect someone's development. It's a way for us to more easily and also more meaningfully understand what development is and how it is a collaboration between so many multiple factors. So, an example of how the developmental systems approach can be used in practice is in the reading that we were assigned in the lesson, where Wexler does a research study of young people in Northwest Alaska, where they were asked to just say what success means to them and like how they project themselves in the future. And it was a very interesting study because even to me it was surprising to see that the girls in the study were more ambitious and had more life goals that can be valued in a dominant world, as opposed to boys who were more focused on just naming hobbies or activities and they just had very different approaches to what success means to them. And I would say that Wexler studies suggest that the girls' definition of success was more valid than boys. And the way in which the developmental systems approach was used in this study is just seeing and evaluating the expectations that are set on both girls and boys in this society of Northwest Alaska. So apparently in this culture, which is one of Bronfenbrenner's subsystems, it is very expected from girls to be leaders and to be homemakers and to be good mothers and to, very surprisingly to me, have good grades in school and graduate college. So already these expectations are huge and are very significant for growth and leadership and intellect, as opposed to boys who were just expected to kind of play sports and fish and have certain hobbies that are a bit more temporary or like smaller achievements, I would say. And that is an example of how we can see that culture and the expectations of certain groups of youth in a culture can affect their visions and their projections for their own future. So we can see that there was a huge difference between boys who are youth influenced by very narrow gendered notions of success, economic resources, because most of the hobbies, as Wexler mentioned, depended on having money to afford those hobbies. So economic resources and possible health disparities that apparently were common in men, versus an influence of expanded opportunities for leadership and livelihood, which is what is seen in young girls who basically were raised with the mindset of the world is your oyster and you just need to work hard and you can do anything you can and you should study and graduate and be an amazing mother. Both the girls and the boys in this study were from the same local communities, but even the expectations set to you by your parents and your elders, the path that previous generations have already laid out for the younger generation, the opportunities and possibilities that they had access to were different. So this can show how it's more than just biology, and it has a lot to do with the environment, and it has a lot to do with the ecological systems. And finally, Wexler concludes by saying that this is why women are actually the primary breadwinners and the leaders of tribes and even government entities in that culture, which is amazing because that's a first. So yeah, that really makes a lot of sense, how young girls having such huge expectations from an early age project themselves in such big ways and grow to be primary breadwinners and grow to be leaders in their communities, whereas men aren't, because they're mainly just focused and expected to participate in hobbies and gaining certain skills that are not as significant as the ones expected from girls.